In our last lecture, we're going to discuss the ethical idea associated with emotivism. Now, emotivism is perhaps one of the most anti-theoretical views of ethics that we'll come across. Emotivism is an interesting idea in ethics that at one point had a significant traction within Anglo-American ethics. I would dare say, however, that today, that the idea of emotivism is ultimately perhaps no longer treated as it once was. That is, it seems to have lost a significant amount of esteem, given some of the challenges that arose in the 70s and 80s to some of the general principles that underlied the idea. Now, some key ideas within emotivism involve logical positivism. We're going to take a look at how David Hume, a philosopher who we previously briefly discussed, has played a role within some of the ways in which the philosophy developed. We're going to discuss the idea of ethical subjectivism, and then lastly, what emotivism means and how it may challenge some of the ways in which we've conceived of morality thus far. But in order for us to get to that point, we first need to understand a little bit about logical positivism. In philosophy, there's traditionally been a break over the past couple hundred years between what we call Anglo-American philosophy or analytic philosophy and continental philosophy, which is generally philosophy that's more based out of Europe. Now, continental philosophy is going to be stuff more along the lines of what we saw with existentialism. That is going to focus more on illumination and on certain ways of life. Whereas analytic philosophy is going to focus much more on the role of language and logic. In particular, logical positivism is an idea that is born out of analytic philosophy. Basically, logical positivism is going to try to combine the role of empiricism and rationalism. It's going to sound remarkably Enlightenment-esque in that sense. Logical positivism states that language reveals certain facts of the world, and that language that we may utilize, which cannot be traced back to some type of fact, that is, to some type of knowledge of the world, is ultimately misleading, or perhaps even nonsense. This involves a significant rejection of metaphysics, as well as rejections of any type of language that doesn't establish facts. So therefore, logical positivism is going to look to understand the way in which it's going to look to understand the world, that is, through ways in which we can use language to make truth statements. There's a belief that as we gain more knowledge of the world, and as we begin to modify language, we can eventually develop a very precise language that, again, will allow us to understand more things about ourselves and about the world. So we're looking at a very scientific understanding of language. To some extent, this is based off of some of the work of David Hume. Now, Hume argued in the 18th century, that the Enlightenment project wasn't quite as maybe honest with itself as it would like to have been. Hume argued that reason judges either facts or relations between things. Morality, on the other hand, according to Hume, doesn't involve facts that can be grasped by reason alone, so it has to involve the perception of relationships. But non-human things cannot bear the same type of relations that humans do, but we don't use the same kind of judgment for non-human things. That is, I don't, for example, say that this tree is being bad. So if I'm going to try to distinguish between human things and non-human things, I have to use something that's more potent than rationality. Rationality is not going to do it for us. Praise and blame can't be a matter of rationality. Additionally, Hume argued, reason doesn't provide motivation for action. We have to look somewhere else. And he says that ultimately that emotion, or what he called sentiment, provides us with that motivation for action. Now again, this is going to when combined with logical positivism, is going to begin to provide the basis for an emotivist critique of ethics. But we're not quite there yet. We need to see further how it developed from these two positions, from logical positivism and from Hume, who said that reason doesn't work in morality without sentiment. According to ethical subjectivism, when we're given a certain moral situation, we express different attitudes towards that situation. We may be able to say that people have different opinions, but where morality is concerned, there are no facts and no one is right. People just feel differently, and that's all there is to it. And if that's the case, there's no objective right or wrong. Well, if there's no objective right or wrong, then obviously moral decisions and moral judgments aren't going to mean anything. All that's going to be said is that we're expressing an attitude. When we say that some action is right or some value is good, all that we're saying is that I approve of it. Now, when we say that it's bad or wrong, all we say is that we disapprove. Well, according to this, we can't actually account for moral disagreement because I can't disagree with expressed attitudes. Ultimately, if you say that killing is wrong, for example, all I can say is that you are telling me that you disapprove of killing. I cannot lodge a critique that makes any sense against your attitude because you have that attitude. I can't argue with that. So this version of subjectivism would tell us that we're always right because we're only expressing our attitude. That we can't be wrong about it unless we're somehow lying about our attitude. Well, this is where we begin to build the case for emotivism. According to emotivism, language can be used to state facts which are true or false. Again, returning back to logical positivism. Language is used to communicate these facts. It can also be used as a command or as an expression of attitude. So again, we've invited in ideas of subjectivism. According to an emotivist critique of ethics, moral language is not a fact-stating language. It gives commands and speaks of attitudes, but it doesn't say anything about the world. So all that we have, ultimately, are disagreements about attitudes and inattitudes. Judgments are only disagreements in attitude. Because we can only say that a person believes one way or another, we can't actually critique it in any way that's meaningful. We avoid the question of rightness. Therefore, we can't say that moral judgments are right or wrong. In fact, we can't even criticize them. All we can say, again, is that you've expressed this attitude, and I've expressed this attitude. Well, if this is indeed the case, this leads us to challenge the role of reason within ethics. Motivists try to look to see how we try to persuade other people through moral commands. And they state, quote, any statement about any fact which any speaker considers likely to alter attitudes may be adduced as a reason for or against an ethical judgment. What we know is that persuasion is not always an issue of reason. When is the last time you were swayed one way or another simply because of an argument that somebody gave you? If any claim can count as a reason for judgment, it has to be relevant. But relevance doesn't always mean that the claim is true. Many times people appeal to false statements in order to try to persuade somebody. Look at political speech, for example. In political speech, we have multiple, and you can easily find examples through organizations such as PolitiFact, for example, where they evaluate what a politician may say. And oftentimes they find that the statement is false. But they're trying to persuade you. They're trying to look for something more than just reason. They try to use emotion. And that's a dangerous place to be. Because when we start using emotion instead of reason, whenever we say that we can't criticize rightness or wrongness because all we're doing is expressing emotional attitudes. Though it may be in a place where, according to the emotivist, ethics falls apart. Now, luckily, this doesn't really work out that well. Philosophers such as Quine, for example, significantly challenged the premises of logical positivism. And while many ethicists actually favor what Hume says and believe what Hume says is very true, the logical positivist argument about the way in which we use language doesn't seem to pan out. Quine and Chomsky, for example, provided a significant challenge to logical positivism. And it may be very clear to see from their writings that emotivism as a critique of ethics simply doesn't work.